You ready? Okay. Sure. Yeah, it is. Good evening. Welcome to the Explorers Club. I'm standing in for our president, Richard Garriott, who is decompressing from summiting Kilimanjaro with his oldest daughter last weekend. So next time you see him, congratulate him. That is not really an easy climb. My name is Benjamin Halsey. I am the chair of the legal committee. And it makes you wonder when you ask a lawyer to introduce the speaker, are you only going to introduce him, or are you going to make sure that you monitor things for trademark and copyright violations? At any rate, you'll like our speaker tonight. He's my very good friend, Fred McLaren, longtime friend. We have spent many pleasurable evenings drinking, cussing, and telling lies. As most of you know, Fred is a former president of the club. He is a recipient of the Explorers Medal as well as a whole bunch of others. Fred went to the Naval Academy. He joined the Navy, of course, after that. Served most of his career on nuclear submarines, ultimately rising to the rank of captain. I think we're all in for a treat listening to his speech tonight because he's made several deepwater dives, some of which were probably ill-advised, including 2 dives to the Bismarck, which he's going to talk about tonight. Fred?
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Generally, I don't have any trouble projecting my voice where you can hear me. And I want to warn you right now up front, anybody that falls asleep is my mortal enemy. And I'll sneak up and put this mic right under your mouth so everybody can hear you snore. Okay, this is a very interesting, and I'm going to speak right here because I think you can hear me fine. That's a little restricted. This is, I think, a very timely talk in that there's been a lot of talk, in view of the Titan being lost last year, diving Titanic. But most people don't realize that there's been a bunch of us that have been diving much deeper than Titanic. Bismarck is another 3,000 feet, and then there's a couple of more, and I had an opportunity, but I turned it down to dive down to 18,000 feet on the German, or the Japanese submarine I-52. They're looking for gold. Well, they didn't find it because they looked at the wrong place, spent all this money, and but before I'm a professional, as are most of those that went on these dives with me. And just to give you an example, before I made my first dive using a Russian Mir submersible, I flew over to Kaliningrad and spent 3 days hand over hand looking thoroughly through that and all the papers pertaining to the Russian Mir submersible that I was going to be going down. And the reason we went over it because in 1997, I initiated the business. We were going to use it to make the first dives at the North Pole. And then when we got going, we decided, well, gee, let's dive Titanic. Let's dive Bismarck. And then I think, as many of you know, in 2005, 2006, I, of all people, had the same thing happen to me, happened through the history of exploration, betrayal, and a rich adventure tourist parachuted in, bought the North Pole trip. All of a sudden, I'm just off the website, gone, even though I spent 7 years preparing for it. And remember, we almost did it with, supported by Quark Expedition and everything. Came very, very close. So I ground my teeth for a while on that. But the other thing that most people don't know is my last 2 years in the Navy, I commanded a major Department of Defense underwater lab complex of 6 labs, $1 billion budget, 3,200 science and engineers. So I was involved in a lot of underwater classified programs. And then finally, as a midshipman, I spent 2 months on the battleship Missouri. So I know about battleships and their armament. At the Naval Academy, I also had a full year of ordnance and gunnery. And I'm telling you all this ahead of time because it's going to weigh in on the conclusions and some of the things I say. And then finally, I was a scuttling officer for 2 different submarines. Now that was like 4th of July all over. I went to demolition school a couple of times and played with plastic explosives and blew up all kinds of damn things. It was, I was just a lieutenant. Boy, was that fun. Nothing like it, but you can't carry it forth into civilian life, unfortunately, without trouble. Okay, well, I'm going to get back in position now. And I will throw it open for questions at the end. I'd like you to not ask any questions during the course of my talk. And I always say there's nothing like a stupid question. But I'm always looking for that next stupid question. And my friend right there remembers, I think we were on the same trip. We're in a Zodiac, and a young, not so young lady in a Zodiac, we're going after a polar bear, says, "How far are we above sea level?" So if you've got a question like that for me, you will be remembered by everybody thanks to me. Okay, now the talk is going to be in a couple of parts. I think it's very important that you know some of the history of the German battleship Bismarck. I dare say if I put it to test and walked around, it'd probably be about a quarter to a third of you would say, "Bismarck? What was the Bismarck? Oh, that's up in North Dakota." Yeah, right, okay. Well, anyway, Bismarck, at the time she went to sea, she had a very short life of 19 days. She was the most powerful battleship on Earth. And there you see, and of course, what is that first way? It means heavy battleship, or words to that effect. But she's absolutely beautiful. And she's beautiful on the bottom. And, you know, originally I was going to make this in memory of 4 people that were with me on that dive that are all dead. There you see at the top on the right hand is Don Walsh. He was on that dive. He's gone. Down in the foreground is my good friend Ph.D. Nargeolet. He's dead. And then my diving partner was Emory Kristoff on my first dive. He's gone. And then, I don't know if this is going to work for the, I don't have a light on that. Oh.
The first button on the top.
Where?
The first button on the top.
Oh, this one.
Oh.
Now,
What do you want to do?
I want to put a spotlight on that. But look on the left here in the lower. That's the late Mike duGruy, the famous BBC underwater photographer, cinematographer. I want to be able to put a light on that.
This one, you're going to see it quite well.
Well, anyway, I'm going to wave my arms around. You're just going to have to follow me, okay? Okay, but
Okay.
I began thinking of, look in the lower, upper left-hand corner. That's David Bright. Now, most of you don't know him, another member of the Explorers Club. We made a Titanic dive together. He died on his 49th dive down to the Andrea Doria, just sort of supervising some commemorative film, and he died of bends. But then I realized I've also dived with Ralph White on Titanic in the upper right hand. You remember him, he was working with Cameron on the movie Titanic. And then finally, Phil Newton of Newtco, a prominent member of the Explorers Club. He's died, but I could also add Jeannie Clark, Steve Etchemendy of Maberry. All of a sudden, it sort of mounts up. And it makes me wonder, geez, here I am in my late 50s. Where are these people? Where are these people going? Well, anyway, now here on the, okay, just look now. These are very important. You see that in 1933, Hitler is appointed the chancellor. And then just what, less than 2 years later, all of a sudden, he is in charge of the German government, and right away, he starts to renounce the Treaty of Versailles. Now, why do we care about that? Well, the Treaty of Versailles restricted to the Germans, believe it or not, to only 15,000 in their navy. They could only have 35 ships, none of them, and they could only have 4 of them, 10,000 tons, the rest had to be destroyers, and they were forbidden to build submarines. Well, that didn't go well, and then in 1935, the British decided they better cave in a little bit to the Germans because it was clear they were going to go their own way. So they made an agreement, okay, Germans will only build 35% of the Royal Navy. Well, of course, that was bullshit again. Meanwhile, Hitler went ahead and laid the keels and started launching the first of 12 submarines, and they were off and running. And then you see the 2 most powerful battleships in the world were going to be the Bismarck and the Tirpitz, and so they moved right on. And then they started recruiting from the Navy. I love this. It means, of course, German Navy operation. You know, they're heading over the horizon there on some exciting operation. And then you see recruiting, I love the submarines right off the bat. And then, you know, building is going on seriously. Don't waste any time. They launched the Bismarck. I'll show you a picture in a minute. First crew members report, she's commissioned. She starts her sea trials in the Baltic, and then she finally goes out on what's called Operation Rhine. And she only lasts from the time she goes to sea to that operation 19 days before she's on the bottom. It's a tragic story in many ways. And there you see the wonderful launch attended by Hitler himself. Okay, now, why the Bismarck? Why the Tirpitz? Well, they decided that in addition to using submarines to sink British ships and all kinds of trade, why surface ships can do a good job too. And so you see down here that you had, February and March 1941 in the middle, just 2 heavy cruisers go out and sink 22 merchant ships in one operation. So the idea with Bismarck and Tirpitz is to send a battleship or 2 out with these cruisers, and the battleships then could engage any warship escorting these merchant ships, and they just decimate everybody. And you'll see in the next, just look at that. Look on the right there, how many merchant ships were sunk each of those years. And you notice initially, most of them were sunk by surface ships, not submarines. It isn't towards the end that more and more are sunk by submarines. And there she is. She's absolutely a beautiful ship, the most beautiful in the world. And she's beautiful on the bottom and malevolent. And of course, the agreement with the British was no more than 35,000 gross tons. Well, she went way over that, over 50. But Hitler then wasn't paying attention to anything then. He found that he could get away with whatever he wanted to do. And here the main battery is 8, essentially 15-inch guns. And, okay, when we talk about sinking the Bismarck, something else that's not known, here's a cross-section, but look on the right. See the red there on the far right. Okay, Bismarck had two different types of armor. On the side, suspended from above and below the waterline, you'll see it in the red, was what was called a panzer girdle, 15 inches of high-test steel, but very special because they also added several titanium and a few metals to make it even more better, probably something more typical of 18, 20 inches of armor. And then look what's next to it. You've got the hull itself that's 15 inches thick. The other thing is not commonly known as Bismarck was made up of 22 high-test steel, watertight compartments. And so her only vulnerable spot was her deck level, but even that was 4.5 to 5 inches thick. So you'll see soon here just what this results in and why. But the main thing, in my opinion, and certainly on my experience and knowledge, back in those days it would have taken a nuclear weapon to have sunk the Bismarck. Now my British colleagues will take great exception, and all I say is, Pell, how much time did you spend down there looking at Bismarck? Well, you know, there's only a handful, there's maybe 3 or 4 of us alive that have made these dives. Okay, and here, 5th of May, 1941, commissioning. Hitler's aboard on, there you see the Admiral Captain Lindemann. Oh, there's Lindemann up on the left. Handsome looking guy, famous for his ears. Made a great sonarman. And they go right out right away. Now, unfortunately, they were going to go out with 2 other light cruisers and with a total of 4 ships. Unfortunately, one was damaged by bombs and the other had some engineering problem. So just the 2 of these, the Bismarck and the Prince Eugen, went out to raid convoys. And here you see the Prince Eugen, almost 20,000 tons, very fast ship, 32 knots. How much is that? Probably 35 or 36 miles per hour. And a main battery of 8-inch guns. Pretty formidable. So this is a perfect, very formidable. They head out, and by and large, they've been undetected up to this time, although the British were aware that this was in the offing through intelligence. And then the British kept sending in aircraft, and due to lousy weather, it wasn't until this day on the, I think it was the 21st, that a reconnaissance Spitfire caught Bismarck anchored in a Norwegian fjord, the Grimstad Fjord. And so this was reported back. And then Bismarck, realizing she'd been sighted. Now, I'm going to show you some busy charts here, but I'm just going to focus on certain parts of these charts, ignore the rest. But notice here on the right, 21st of May, Bismarck heads off, and she, along with the Prince Eugen, heads to the north, and they're going to try and escape, go to the Denmark Strait. I wonder what happened to the stool I was going to sit on here. Here it is. It's an awkward position up here. There we go. I don't want you to fall asleep or miss a word, okay? All right, now look. So they head up completely undetected. Now between Iceland and Greenland, you had the ice line off Greenland, and then off the east of Iceland was a pretty dense minefield. And then you had 2 British heavy cruisers, the Norfolk and the Suffolk, patrolling that, because at that time the British are already aware that escape's going to be made, and these 2 ships are going to go out and raid the convoy. So the 2 ships detect, one of them almost got sunk, and then they fall behind and trail the Prince Eugen and the Bismarck as they head south between Greenland and Iceland. In the meantime, we're going to go to the next one. The British fleet arouses and starts to scramble ships from Scapa Flow. And one of the ships is the pride and joy of the British Navy, the HMS Hood, built in the early 1920s. One of the fastest warships on Earth then, very powerful, and it was what every nation war-gamed against, was the British battleship Hood. Now, there was only one problem with the Hood. Very light on armor. Very light on the armor on the sides of the ship, and not more than about 2 or 3 inches deck armor. So she's just an accident ready to happen. And of course, they picked a really ugly skipper there to manage that. That's an old boyfriend of Fania Rose's there, in case anybody interested. Okay, so here on the right now you see the Hood, and then the brand new British battleship, the Prince of Wales, deploys from Scapa Flow. They have no idea where Bismarck is, but they go across south of Iceland, as you see, and somehow during that time, up till when they're about maybe 2/3 across, the 2 British cruisers have a good fix on the Bismarck and they're trailing them. But then they lose all radar contact, and so there's some hours that go by that there's no contact on the Bismarck or the Prince Eugen, and because the Bismarck had fired some shells at the 2 British cruisers, it put the Bismarck's radar out of commission, and so they changed position with the Prince Eugen. So when the Hood and the Prince of Wales detected them, they thought there was Bismarck out in front. And as you'll see in a minute, they wasted their first shots shooting at the Prince Eugen instead of the Bismarck. And so off they go. And then they got, when they did detect, they got in a position where they had to chase, and then they had to put themselves in a position to parallel, exposing their whole flank to Bismarck and Prince Eugen. I think you get what I'm talking about. Both German ships can put their full batteries on the ship. Now, another funny thing about the Prince of Wales, it's a brand new British battleship. You got 35 or 36 workmen still on board trying to make the gun mounts work. So as they're going in there, they only have 1 or 2 of their 4 main batteries working. They're frantically trying to get everything back in shape. So anyway, they finally encounter, Bismarck fires the first shot, and then there's a rapid exchange. And what were they firing? Well, there's a 15-inch armor-piercing projectile. I happened to go to Hamburg and during 2000, 2001, and actually got to see the size of some of these, almost 2 tons. Can you imagine? They're going to knock the hell out of anything when they hit it. And then there's an exchange, and on the 5th salvo, now earlier the Prince Eugen does land a hit just abaft the stack on the Hood. And it starts a sort of a small fire there. Then on Bismarck's 5th salvo, I realize most of they're shooting a lot of misses, but on the 5th salvo, that penetrates the Hood deck, goes back and ignites a magazine, then a second magazine blows up, and within a minute or so, the pride and joy of the British Navy blows up into 2 pieces, and there's only 3 survivors out of 1,415 men. Okay, well, needless to say, but unfortunately, Bismarck is hit by 3 armor-piercing shells, and It's not necessarily commonly known, but they hit the Bismarck forward, and they sort of severed the lines between two fuel tanks. And Bismarck, when she was in the Norwegian fjord, she chose not to be refueled when she should have. So all of a sudden now, she can't get to two of her main fuel tanks, and just as a result of this, rather than raiding convoys, she's got to try and go back to France and escape. And Prince of Wales is hit by 4 shells, and there's an argument about with the skipper of the Bismarck and the admiral. The skipper of the Bismarck, he didn't want to waste time. He wants to go and kill off the, in addition to the hood, let's go fix that Prince of Wales same time. But the admiral prevails, and so off they go. Now, what happens then? Okay, this is another funny story. You see in the left hand, okay, you got another group coming from Scalpel Flow, and it's made up of a an aircraft carrier, the Victorious. You see on the top there, another battleship, the King George V and the Repulse. But only the aircraft carrier Victorious can do anything about it. So they get in a position to launch a strike. Heavy weather, and you see there are the 9 pilots. Well, believe it or not, they're flying the torpedo plane. It's fabric covered. It can go 95 knots flat out, low altitude, and not a one of these pilots has ever made a carrier takeoff, much less a carrier landing. Absolutely incredible. Nonetheless, they launch a strike against Bismarck. They score 1 hit. Unbelievably, they all get back, safely land. Okay, now Bismarck had over 60 anti-aircraft guns, and as you'll see, they never scored a hit on any of these slow-flying, fabric-covered biplanes. All these guns shooting everywhere. They don't even make a hole in one of these aircraft. So no aircraft has ever shot down. It's just unbelievable. And so Bismarck now is forced to reballast, regain some speed, and head for ultimately Brest, France. Okay, and then they release a smoke screen, and somehow the Prince Eugen is able to go south, refuel from a German ship, and make it safely back to port. Bismarck then starts heading to the southeast, and they lose complete contact on Bismarck. Nobody has any contact, but the admiral thinks, the German admiral thinks that the British have contact, and so he makes a god-awful mistake of broadcasting the radio with shore, revealing their position. Okay, now talk about things going wrong. The navigator on the British ship, the head navigator, he plots the bearings in the wrong direction. So initially, the British go steaming off for a day in the wrong direction. You imagine that guy's career was ended. And then they reverse, and it's too late to do anything. But they know that the Bismarck is heading frantically for the coast of France, where there's a U-boat screen being set up. And so then, out of Northern Ireland, is one of these PBYs, as Bismarck is proceeding, an ensign, an American ensign flying with the Brits, he spots the Bismarck, and we're back in the game again, and the British are. Okay, now this is another funny incident. You really wonder, God's got a sense of humor. Okay, so now meanwhile, Churchill has said, I don't care what you do, sink the Bismarck. Okay, so every British ship at sea, didn't make any difference. They were about to run out of fuel, or they were escorting convoys of troops going to the Mediterranean. They were all pulled off to go after the Bismarck. And the Ark Royal is just coming out of the Mediterranean, if you can believe it. So at the ultimate limit, they launch a group of very experienced pilots. I mean, they've been sinking Italian ships there, And if anybody was going to hit the Bismarck, and so somebody has a bright idea because the British heavy cruiser, the Sheffield, is with them. Let's send the Sheffield ahead, find the Bismarck, and the planes can use that as a guiding post. Well, that's not the way it worked. There was clouds there and all that, and so as those swordfish fabric-covered planes are going slowly along, they look down to the clouds. God almighty, they see a ship. Must be the Bismarck. So what do? Instead of going on and attacking Bismarck, they identify the British cruiser as a Bismarck, and so they all go attack their own ship. Now that's some kind of angry skipper who constantly maneuvers. Nobody hits him, and only one of these aircraft recognize that, gee, that's one of our own. So then they go back. Now there's only one chance. And so they go back and reload, and they only have one more chance to get Bismarck. Bismarck at this time is probably only about 2 hours short of getting within a U-boat screen, and she's safe. So this time they go again, they attack the Bismarck, and you know, I showed you the armor and all that. Okay, they scored maybe some hits, but the one key hit was the last one launched by the squadron commander, and each one of these swordfish carried only one torpedo. It's what we in submarines call the up-the-kilt shot. The stern, and it hit the starboard rudder, the starboard propeller, the center propeller, and they were screwed, so to speak. And all Bismarck could do then, because the seas were 20 or 30 feet, they couldn't put divers in the water to do anything. All they could do was either go in circles or turn back in the direction of their adversaries and go into the sea and sort of establish a comfortable level for defending themselves. And that's the situation. Meanwhile, you have these, on the left there, you see have these 5 British destroyers. When the poor old cruiser Sheffield's already been attacked by its own forces, they try and attack Bismarck during the night, but Bismarck chases them away. And then, okay, now this again is busy, but look where this X is, Bismarck. Look at that X in the middle. We're only looking at about 10 nautical miles. And what you're looking is at the last day on the 27th of May. And remember, she just left the Baltic Sea on the 19th of May. And this is where the British forces are disposed. And they know that Bismarck is stuck there. And so they take the time, they wait till the next morning about 9 o'clock and then move in. But the blood is up because they've, the hood has been sunk. Churchill is after them, sink it, sink it, sink the damn thing. And so rather than standing off and firing high trajectory shells that might penetrate Bismarck's deck, they close in 5,000 or 6,000 yards and fire several thousand shots of God knows what. I mean, there's at least 300 to 400 of just these 15-inch shells, but they're flat trajectory, and they just clean everything off Bismarck's deck. But if they hit the water, of course, it'd be just like throwing a rock. And even more interesting, you see, you got some, as it works out, you got Bismarck up in that X, you got British ships on one side, on every side, so they're also in danger of hitting each other. So it's an interesting situation. And so finally, there's this exchange. Bismarck fires the first shots, but doesn't really hit anything. They're in bad shape now, particularly the weather and just being able to hold that one course. And then finally, the British have just pounded the crap out of it. What they're waiting to do is the Germans put up a flag of surrender. Well, the Germans aren't about to do that, and probably there isn't anybody left alive to do that. In the meantime, the second in command, before he gets killed, he orders abandon ship. He also orders scuttling the ship. Now, the British always claim, and you know, I think there's a couple of people in the Explorers Club, I'm not going to name who they are, who will argue, be ready to go right to the mat here with me, but you don't, like the Dorset here, fire 2 torpedoes into one side, 1 torpedo in the other, and then a minute later, the ship sinks. No, that's not the way it works. A torpedo doesn't work that fast. So, but anyway, this is about the Bismarck starts to sink only because she has a scuttling party of 26 men that have charges. They've blown up all the sea connections. They open up everything open to the sea. The watertight doors in these 22 watertight compartments, ventilation system wide open. Now I know you'll see people like Cameron and others saying, well, she was slowly sinking, she would eventually sink. Well, no, if she wasn't going to sink, when you got a big crew, and they're all engineers, because all the engineers survived, what are they going to do? They're going to be doing damage control. And so they would keep that thing afloat. But what was the point of everything? What was the point of scuttling? Well, it's the same way when I was a scuttling officer. You didn't want to ever have your ship captured and taken in port. Boy, I mean, what a feather in the British cap that would be at that time. So it sank, and as it went down, it rolled over, and those big 15-inch gun mounts, they just sat in what are called barbettes, 2 forward, 2 in the afterdeck, by gravity. So when Bismarck started down, the ship rolled over, they dropped out. Bismarck sort of righted, and then as you see, went down and hit this underwater sea mount, sort of slid along, and then ended up upright. Okay, now this is a picture, took me a long time to get, because the British, in effect, and you know, there's not much, nobody wants to publicize this, but over 1,000 of those below deck on the Bismarck, engineers mostly, got out of the ship and into the water when they abandoned ship. They were not hurt in any way. So there you see several hundred of these. I have another picture showing much of the same, but I've showed you both. You'd essentially see that there's, somewhere over between 900 and 1,000 young men, basically average age about 20 to 22, in the water. However, only 110 are picked up by just 1 cruiser and 1 destroyer. Now, why weren't the rest picked up? Well, somebody thought they saw a periscope, and they immediately abandoned the rescue operations and took off. And so all those young men were left to drown. I mean, close to 1,000. The next morning, there was about 5 people who survived the night. 2 were picked up by a German U-boat, and then 3 by a German supply ship. These 5 men just happened to survive the night, but the rest had already gone to the bottom. And this is the way Bismarck looks on the bottom. Now, obviously the visibility is such that you really can't see it like this, but you notice that the main tourists, the main mounts are gone, and those holes are what we call barbettes. And for those that want to dive Bismarck, I always tell anybody, you don't need fancy equipment. I think I told Dania this. All you need is a big rock, and you jump in the water, and it's good for a one-way trip if you hold on to it. Okay, now funny, Bismarck was essentially intact, but on the way down, due to a structural defect that the Germans later corrected with other ships, about 10 meters of the stern just cleanly broke off like a meat cleaver had hit it. And then I said we decided to make the very first manned dives to Bismarck in July of 2001. Now, Ballard had discovered the Bismarck in 1989, but nobody had ever gone down in a submersible to look at her close up. So the group of us on this particular expedition, 2001, we did a program for National Geographic, and it was Ph.D. Nargeolet and myself, Emory Kristoff, Mike duGruy, and a few others, all professionals. And Lisa Sony, who's a member of the Explorers Club, was the producer. And then, in spite of what anybody says, Cameron followed us. We made the first manned dives. And then this is the patch that, as far as I know, I'm the only diver that the Russians gave this to. I made 5 of these dives with the Mir submersibles, and I also headed up 2 of these expeditions myself. So what we used to take the submersibles out, and you see the hangar in the back on the left-hand side, is during the Cold War, this was the largest largest oceanographic ship on the ocean during the Cold War. And during the Cold War, it carried something like over 400 Soviet scientists. Now, when we leased this for deep ocean expeditions, we only had about 12 or 14 scientists aboard. It was pretty much a minimal crew, but perfect for what we were doing. And there you see the first group. And if you look down the lower left-hand corner, there's the late Captain Ph.D. Nargeolet, who was on that trip with me, a good friend. You see Don Walsh standing behind him up there. I'm over here somewhere, Emory Kristoff. Mike duGruy is in there somewhere. You might, and then in the middle, you see the 2 survivors of Bismarck who were part of the scuttling party, and they didn't want to make a dive, but we did privately show them what we saw. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of tears and emotion as it finally brought closure in their minds. And here's the Mir submersible. It's about 18.5 tons, about 26 feet long. And inside that is a sphere, as you'll see, a little over 2 meters. There you see the viewing ports, and then these extenders out there. You can even have cameras mounted on them. Or I've never participated in any salvage operation, but you also had grabbers on there to pick things up. And there you see the stern, and you can make about 5 knots. And how long can you stay in the water? Well, probably close to 4 days. You have enough oxygen on there. And there you see the inside. Inside diameter 6.1 meters, but you got all kinds of equipment around you. And somehow you put 3 grown adults. Anatoly is lying on his stomach in the center, and the other 2 of us are on one side or the other. And it's ideal for a 4-foot person, because then you've got to put your calves and your feet behind these electrical panels. And meanwhile, when you start the dive, the temperature is close to 90 degrees, humidity about 90. And by the time in 2.5 to 3 hours later, the temperature inside the submersible, surrounding water, is about 32 to 34, and you got condensation flowing down. Well, you can imagine what goes through your head. My first degree is electrical engineering, and I'm thinking of all this water running down behind these electrical panels, and I got my bare feet behind there. That's could have a spectacular outcome. And there's an interesting shot. Now that's the one hatch out, and you can open it from the inside. Now why is there that bar there? Well, the rumor is, I'm sure he's going to deny it, but a very famous man that made a movie about diving a very famous wreck apparently was so excited on his first dive that he tried to get out of the submersible while it was still submerged. Apparently he had to be wrapped on the side of the head with a wrench to get his attention, and so then the Russians installed this. And here I am with a crazy Emory Kristoff. Now, this guy is a very famous National Geographic underwater photographer with a great sense of humor. Unfortunately, he's gone now too, but on the dive, he took down a water pistol, and as we passed 14,000 feet, Anatoly Sagovich is on his stomach, steering us down. He shoots Anatoly in the back of the head with a water pistol as he passed him. Well, there was sort of pandemonium. And Anatoly was a little short on sense of humor. Okay, here we are being lifted off, and you just have that single titanium pin up there holding that near submersible as we head down. And then what we do is we get in the water, scuba divers detach us, they check everything clear, and then they pull away, and then we're clear to dive. So we're probably here maybe about 50 meters, maybe 50 meters away from the ship now. We're ready to start our descent. And there you see Anatoly, and as you can tell, the inside of the submersible, again only 6.1 meters, is, it's just a little over 2.1 meters, is all kinds of equipment. And here's where he lies. He's on his stomach. You see the compass in the middle. On the far left there is the device you're using for, right there on the very far, for maneuvering everything. And these center rods are for moving these extenders. And now we're looking for Bismarck. And I'll tell you, in the next few minutes, it's going to get really exciting for another reason. Because we're going down too fast. And Anatoly still hasn't trimmed it up. Now, we were going down fast the whole time. He still hadn't trimmed it up. And I'm on the port side looking, and all of a sudden I see these forward barbette coming up, and I yell, starboard, starboard, starboard. And he whisked us across, and we just, I'm just going to digress and show you a picture of the bow. Beautiful, streamlined, malevolent ship. Some others of the bow. Now I'm showing you a whole lot of bow shots just because I don't want to cheat. I want to come up with as many as we shoot on Titanic, so Bismarck gets her due. But this is all the bow. Wonderful teakwood deck in good shape. But there's the barbette, and we just skim over the top of that. If we had fallen into it, it'd be like falling down into a 3-story building, and the mirror would have fit right in there. We just missed it and then thumped down hard on the bottom. I took all these shots. Now look at that. We were one of the British 15-inch shells, sort of splintered part of a barbette. And again, and then I told you that the main mounts fell out of the Bismarck. There we encountered one of them. It's upside down, and underwater, it's sitting on the bottom. It's like looking at an upside down 3-story building. And we had 2 of these mirror submersibles, not just one. So we dive one fall, that's the one we went in, mirror 1, was followed a half hour later by mirror 2. And then here you see some of the bollards on the bow for lines and things like that. And then we're looking at some of I took every one of these pictures, and you realize these are the first man dives, and so you just shoot, shoot, shoot. You didn't have all the fancy equipment. Most of these I took with a Minolta 35mm camera because it was the handiest to use and then force the development of the film. But here's one of these over 60 anti-aircraft guns that did a lot of firing but didn't hit anything. But early on, one of the British shells did penetrate the deck. It went down into a hospital area, killing outright over 150 people, everybody in the hospital and the surrounding compartments. Look at that. That's the kind of damage they could have done if they had stood off and patiently just lobbed shells in. And then this is the forward part of the ship, the superstructure. Knee line, the British are just constantly at close range, 5,000 to 6,000 yards, pounding the crap out of it. So it's amazing we see anything standing. And you see it just beat the hell, blew everything the kingdom come. Everybody topside was killed. No survivors from the deck. And the Germans had 4 of these Arado 196 observation planes to spot targets And what they'd hoped to do is launch one with the ship's logs and at least get that away. But in that first encounter with the Hood, one lucky British shot ruined the catapult for launching these. So there's, they see the catapult, but it's unusable. And there you see the remnants of the hangar where they put all four of these. And then here's some more of the gun mounts. There is essentially on the left is a 5-inch mount. This is again 37 millimeter. You got anemones growing everywhere out of gun barrels. More of the same. And how'd you like to be in that gun mount? Look at that big hole in the front there. So one of those armor-piercing shells went in there, and that pretty well cleaned that crew out. And you got a hole up there on the top there, a hole here, a hole there, a hole there. Being topside, again, more of these anti-aircraft guns. This is a very interesting anti-aircraft gun. You could elevate it to about 89 degrees. And it's very flexible. It should have been wonderful. It should have been able to depress it and shoot down any of these swordfish. Now, you know, the Germans have really been noted. They certainly were in World War I and the start of World War II. They're very accurate gunners. But all these anti-aircraft guns were calibrated for higher flying, faster flying aircraft, not fabric-covered biplanes hugging the surface. And they never shot down or hit a single British plane. And then this is a 20 millimeter mount anti-aircraft gun. That's just completely obliterated. Look at the hole made in the back of that mount over there to the left. And then here's one of the after barbettes. And this is the after director, again banged up, but not as severely hit, because this is one of the areas where the engineers were able to escape later. And there's only one surviving officer out of 110, the 4th gunnery officer, and he was able to get out this way. Some more of the bollards on the afterdeck. Here we see the after teak deck. It really is surprisingly good shape. And then this is the only swastika that was on that ship. It was on the after deck. And then as we move further aft, I told you about that structure failure. Well, look at that. It's just like a meat cleaver. Just cut it off. And then as we go down the stern, just a nice cleavage, having nothing to do with being hit by anything. And then there you see the starboard rudder, and this is where that torpedo came in and just jammed the hell out of everything, and it was hopeless. They couldn't escape. Okay, now I made a total of 2 dives on Bismarck, one in 2001, 2002, spending a total of almost 13 hours looking at her close up. And I have to confess that on my first dive, I looked at Bismarck like a submarine commander would have, which I was, as an evil entity. You didn't think of the people aboard. And easily for 2 or 3 hours, I looked at it that way. And then all of a sudden it began registering that I'm seeing hundreds of these black boots all over the bottom like black tombstones, all representing all these young men that drowned and sank to the bottom. And there's just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, and occasionally foul weather jackets. You could just see the body came and arrested right there. Okay, something entirely different. On the second dive in 2002, with the late Mike duGruy, the cinematographer of World War from BBC, we're passing 14,000 feet. And out of nowhere comes this, now this is a regular barracuda, but what came slowly by us was a huge barracuda-shaped fish that probably was close to 28 feet long. And huge eye. Now you see the jaw of a standard barracuda. Well, the jaw line on this was about 4 or 5 times that, and the upper teeth were all just showing. And then instead of the head, you had very primitive, large scales on this huge monster. Okay, now right now there's only, and it just took its time going ever so slowly by us at a 45 degree. I've had lots of nightmares, my wife will attest to this thing. And frankly, I long since had changed my mind about getting buried at sea, because I thought, gee, what if you're in that shroud and you're not really dead, and there you are without a cell phone, and do I want these horrible things like hagfish and black gulpers and rat tails finishing me off slowly? No. So when I got back to port, I said, forget it. None of that heroic. I want to get buried where I'm a little more familiar with the territory. But anyway, this thing, there's only 2 of us alive that have seen it. But believe me, it's real. And I think Mike duGruy got about 8 or 10 seconds footage of it. And the only time I've ever seen some of that, we don't know what he did with it ultimately, but in the first edition of Blue Planet, the Deep Sea, most people have never noticed. Apparently, it's right in that. I've just seen it a couple of times and then it's vanished. But I'll tell you, this thing is real, and it won't be named. But if it is named, I'll name it after Benjamin Halsey here. But that's not all. Now, this is the possibility. See, because in the deep sea, now I'm talking about over 400 meters deep, there's an estimated 2 million species. Okay, well, right now, only about 375,000 have been identified. So there you see on the left, you see the giant squid. Many of you know in the past decade, the colossal squid with a body about the size of a school bus was discovered by the Japanese. And then there's always been rumors for the last several hundred years about the giant Pacific octopus with a span of 100 feet. And Denis, I'm counting on you finding this in that cave in Indonesia. Anyway, there you see the giant barracuda. It definitely exists. And then, as some of you may know, for about the last 100, 150 years, off the southeast coast of New Zealand, fishermen have reported, and then just lately, apparently around Australia, a huge shark. Okay, what are we thinking about? Well, the megalodon, a white shark that's between 50 and 60 feet long. And you wonder, where are these things where we need them? Well, maybe they're down there somewhere in the ocean. And so anyway, all these dives were long. I always had the good luck of being retrieved in rough seas, taking 2 hours to find us, and you're rolling around. And I always called all these dives, I made 5 of them, 4 Advil, 2 Bonine dives. Bonine for seasickness, because you can imagine, you get in those close quarters and get seasick, your partners are going to kill you on the spot. Also, there are no facilities on there. So that means if you have to do anything, tough. Now, you do have bottles that you can pee in. However, who's going to want to hold your pee bottle while you're taking pictures? And if you don't dare do anything more serious than that. And so it's pretty uncomfortable. But anyway, eventually you get picked up, and there you see me emerging. I don't need to tell you where I'm headed in a hurry. God help anybody gets in my way. And then when we finished those first dives, we had a memorial service right above the side of the Bismarck, and the 2 former Bismarck survivors we made up a wreath and all that, and then we all sang in German that wonderful song, I Had a Comrade, which originates from World War I. Very, very moving. And then, I don't know how many here saw me on the History Channel about 18 years ago, but I did an hour-long program for the History Channel in which I talked about the scuttling of the Graf Spey in the River Plata between Argentina and Uruguay, where that skipper offloaded his crew, scuttled a ship, and then committed suicide. But I had to contrast that with the Bismarck dive for the History Channel, and then I threw in the German High Fleet Grand Scuttle in June of 1919, where 54 of the German ships were interred in the Scapa Flow, and the British left them alone for a day, and the Admiral Reuter ordered the scuttling of all 54 of the ships. And then you see what he says. I think it's quite touching. What has passed away does not return, but if it disappeared in glory, its light shines on for long. And then on Bismarck, you see 2,106 men lost, only 115 survivors, 110 captured by the British. Okay, last but not least, what's my conclusion up close? Did the British sink her or the crew scuttle her? Well, you've already guessed the answer, I'm sure. She went down because the crew scuttled her. It had been damn near impossible to sink her with anything. And yeah, you have people say, okay, well, she was already sinking slowly. She had eventually gone down. No, if they had an abandoned ship, you got close to 1,000 men down there. They know something about damage control. They would have stopped that flooding and taken care of it. But she was legitimately put out of action. That's for sure. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that you turn on the light, that completes my talk. I think you can pretty well tell I love doing things like that. I love getting into it. And it's really wonderful on these deeper dives. Now, right now, everybody's wrestling around the safety of going down Titanic. But still, you know, that's not going to last very long. People are going to want to go down all these other wrecks that are much deeper, that contain all kinds of treasure and God knows what. You just go up in the Great Lakes and there's over 6,000 unlocated wrecks right now. There's just all kinds of stuff out there. I just have to share one other thing. You notice I'm using a cane. Okay, well, in late 2015, I was invited to go on, and this will make your mouth water, Dania. I was invited to go on an expedition in early 2016 to find one of the ships, the shipwreck from Columbus's fourth voyage. Okay, I was going to be a principal. Well, had to have my damn hip replaced. Guess what? They found Columbus's wreck. Then the next expedition in mid-2016, they've located 4 pirate ships off southwest Madagascar. I've been invited to take part in that expedition. No, I have a hip infection. It has to be redone. And they not only find the pirate ships, but they get half the treasure. And, you know, and then I add to that my North Pole trip being taken away by adventure tourists. And, you know, now and then I grind my teeth, understandably. But it's a hell of a lot of fun. It's a great life underwater. The only thing I suggest to everybody, if you're going to get involved, learn what you're doing, do your homework, learn everything conceivable about what you're going to use as a vehicle. Don't just go as a trusting passenger, either under the sea or into space, because in my opinion, you'll just get what you deserve. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Wow. I was very struck by that moment when the leadership of the Bismarck made the decision to sacrifice all those lives, knowing that the boat couldn't continue, rather than surrender, sink it with all the men. And I was also struck by the number of mistakes that were made that you pointed out. And I'm also aware that you, for many years, manned tridents? Trident submarines? Or Ohio class? Which ones?
No, I was always in attack boats.
Okay, so you were in nukes.
I was in nukes, and I always served on it, and I commanded a nuclear
So,
attack
so,
boat.
so there's very little room for mistakes with nukes, and we've had very close calls. I wondered what your advice to us today is, now that we're actually in a situation in which much of the communications we had with nuclear adversaries during the Cold War have broken down. F treaty's gone, Open Skies is gone, START is going to end in 2026. The normal channels of communication of military to military cooperation have broken down, cooperative threat reduction has broken down, and yet we know a history of mistakes that have come so close. What from all of your experience, knowing the kind of decisions that are made in crises, what is the best course forward to ensure that the nukes don't get used?
Well, obviously it's controlled, but right now it's totally out of hand. And I think what's even more distressing is, all these wars and crises, you can pinpoint one man, whether it's in North Korea, Russia. You go around the world, it's just incredible that one person can initiate a series of actions that result in so much loss, whether it's Israel or the Palestinians or Hamas. I mean, you point the finger in every direction. It's the flawed human being, okay? And, all right, I grew up and was trained as a lawyer. I come from a family who has a verifiable 400 or 500-year-old military tradition. Every war we fought in, every war that we fought for this country, both sides of the Civil War, Mexican War, and who did we all fight before that? The British. But with men, my wife tells a story about Bertrand Russell, who's called to speak on why men go to war. So he got up before this audience, big audience, and said, men go to war because they like to go to war, and then he sat down. Well, it's a flaw. I'll be the first to confess it. I was a Cold War skipper. I hold a record for Cold War mission. I relished and loved what I was doing. I was a well-trained, if I had to, killer of other submarines. But on the other hand, once your enemy goes in the water, all bets are off. That's a comrade. It's stupid. Okay, now, going back to your question, how do we gain control again? Well, you can't say we're not going to use them. So you can say, okay, well, we got to increase our deterrence. Trouble is, you got to get people like Putin and that head of North Korea, just for openers, and then you had People's Republic of China, those leaders. How are you necessarily going to get them to listen? And the other thing, none of these people are necessarily that well educated, and a lot of times they don't know what they're dealing with or handling, and that's why we have these string of checks you need. Do you remember during the Cuban Missile Crisis, you had that one Soviet Foxtrot skipper who he had had enough of being harassed. He wanted to fire that one nuclear torpedo. Well, fortunately, two other people had to agree. The political officer agreed, but the other officer did not, and it never happened. And that's the stage we're at. And, you just don't know. And then you can have false alarms. There have been a couple of occasions where people think they're being fired at. So it's going to be a lot of luck. How do we back off? Well, obviously, some of it is everybody standing down from funding arms. I mean, it'd be nice if we weren't sending arms all over the world, but we're doing it for a reason. Wouldn't it be nice if we just stood down from all of that? We should be putting all the money into fighting the greatest enemy of all, this way climate change is just moving right along, and it's going to get us all. So the bottom line is there's no clear-cut answer. Right now, I think it's quite depressing.
I like that you mentioned Bertrand Russell, because the Bertrand Russell Albert Einstein Manifesto, I'm a fellow and trustee of the World Academy of Art and Science that they started with Oppenheimer, and their manifesto ends with these words: remember your humanity, forget the rest.
Exactly, yeah.
Fred, speaking of humanity, I was curious to know what the official protocol is in war on the sea. If a ship is sunk, in the case of the Bismarck, I note they were able to rescue 100 seamen, but then they were not able to finish that by virtue of the fact that they thought they sighted, another, submarine. What would have happened if that had not been the case? Is there a procedure, so to speak, that is of great interest?
What you would hope be, because you had all those other ships, the officer in charge would have them come in, pick everybody up. But the hood, again, I mentioned over and over again, the blood is up. The pride and joy was lost essentially with all hands 3 days before. And think right now about going to war. It's not like it was a century where there's somewhat, for lack of a better term, gentlemanly conduct and the trading of hostages. Right now, when you're dealing with terrorists and things like that, it's even in crime, it's kill, 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 kill. Yeah, you kill your opponent. And I've even advised, we had a trouble up in Colorado with a neighbor who was really threatening. And I went to the local police department there in Netherlands. At one time I was a master of martial arts. I trained in and competed from time to time, full contact kung fu, quite late in life. And I was shocked at what the policeman told me. He said, basically, Captain McLaren, just do what you need to do. It's better to make sure you kill the person. Okay, that's sort of sobering. And that, I have to say, my own observation, that's sort of the attitude that prevails. Now, that's not to say, though, I as a captain, if I encountered something like that, once they're in the water, I personally would do my maximum to save as many as possible, because they're now comrades on the sea, basically, and they're really not much different than I am. They're just serving their country and for their country, and you do the best you can. But then once they're in the water, the conflict is over, then the emphasis should be on saving life to the maximum. But where is this learned? What's being taught in school these days? What's being taught service academies or wherever? Well, what's being taught in any armed forces? And then you got to think how your adversary is taught. And you want to just die because you just weren't up to defending yourself. There you are. Yes?
I was curious, it looked like in the beginning it was almost a joint venture between Russia and your first dive, because all that equipment's I have a voice, you can hear me. I think I was just curious because in the beginning you mentioned the Russians, and I wondered if it was a joint thing between, how did that?
No, well, it was back in the early 90s, 96, they didn't have any money. So we were leasing, we paid full price, a good price, to lease those Russian Mir submersibles and the research vessel. And then passengers, let's say we took out on Titanic, back in those days they paid $27,500 to make a Titanic dive. And then there was only 3 expeditions down to Bismarck, and they paid $44,000. But and then I've lectured on 6 Russian nuclear icebreakers in the North Pole, and then maybe another 25 diesel icebreakers all over the Arctic and everything else. And well, those were always leased by a company. In fact, where's Alicia? I did some of this from the American Museum of Natural History, and then we had a great operation that came to naught. This is going to make you laugh. When I was a couple of years after I was president of Explorers Club, working with the American Museum of Natural History, and you were in charge of travel then, we were going to lease a Russian Typhoon submarine. There's 6 of them, largest in the world. You know, the one used in Hunt for Red October. And you can imagine the enthusiasm I got from members of the Explorers Club still makes me chuckle. Because the men that were going to participate, they all wanted to make sure they got one of these Russian striped sailor suits. Now, we're going to be dressed like Russian sailors. Oh, yeah. And I said, for a little more, you pay a little more and we can get you dressed like a Russian officer. And the trip was good. It was hilarious. But, God, we were full bore, filling a full passenger list. And the officer's uniform had to be a little. Now, what the hell we were going to, well, you know, some of them, they're willing. I said, well, you know, you're going to have to, you get that striped shirt, you're going to have to work down the bilge. Oh, they wanted to be photographed, of course. And it was absolutely hilarious, the enthusiasm. And then, as you would expect, we're getting, well, Putin is grabbing more and more. All of a sudden, the price starts to go up, and then the people got cold feet, and that was the end of it. This was a hilarious project. I don't know what we were going to call that, Operation something or other, but
Okay.
huh?
The Americans didn't have that same.
No, we're using it for deterrence. We weren't going to. No, the Russians really, the Soviet, you know, they didn't even have enough money to maintain their ships back at that time. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and the various times I went into Murmansk, God, you'd have these submarines partially sunken in the harbor there and going through it. Things were a mess, rusting aircraft carriers. Things were really bad. And they resented that. I remember, you know, because they're having to just rent everything they have to us. And, you know, it's all they can do to bite their tongue. They'd probably like to throw all of us overboard.
Captain, you had alluded to the fact that the Hood was the fastest machine out there and was the cat's meow, but it didn't have all of the protective iron to keep it afloat. In retrospect, while it was faster and quicker and so forth, if you can just essentially know how to vector where it would be just because it's faster, would you want to have been on that ship?
In retrospect, absolutely not. And certainly knowing what your no, any kind of large warship, lightly armored. Well, hey, let me give you an example right now. I was an instructor at wargaming in the War College back in the late 60s. Okay, most of you probably don't know that the prediction to go to war with anybody, the lifetime of any surface ship, particularly an aircraft carrier, considering you're dealing with an adversary that has cruise missiles, is about a half hour. So, no, I wouldn't want to be on anything on the surface in wartime, period, no matter how heavily armored. But back in those days, see, you still didn't believe this kind of thing was going to happen. You know, and they were scheduled to be more heavily armored, but they never got around to it.
Didn't I tell you you'd be treated to a really interesting talk? Fred, thank you for taking time out of your very busy, deep diving schedule to come talk to us. Fabulous talk. Thank you.
Well, the one thing I've got lined up now is on the 6th of January, 6th of October with my wife and Rick and Patty Alkus and another Explorers Club member, Amber Sparks, you might know her. Anyway, we've got about 8 or 10 Explorers Club members, and I started this as a joke last Thanksgiving when I saw Incredible Adventures advertising cage shark dives. So I just put on Facebook the day before Thanksgiving, this is the perfect gift for that obnoxious relative at Thanksgiving. Well, my wife Avery's niece didn't read the obnoxious, and she said, "Oh, God, you're going to do a shark dive. We want to go." And then her daughter is 16, loves sharks. So all of a sudden now, there's 12 of us on the 6th of October are going to be white shark cage diving off the Farallon Islands off San Francisco, and it's utterly insane, okay? Now, the reassuring thing is, and you know, the cage is Liz Taylor, Sylvia Earle's daughter, made the cage at her outfit. And the reassuring thing is, if one of those, and these sharks are about 20 feet long, if they do bump it loose from the yacht, the cage will float. Well, that's really reassuring. So, utter insanity, but Rick says you're going to get wet, and I said, "You're damn right." He says, "All right, I'm going with you." So, and we've told the young women, we'll have your back. They're going to be in the front of the cage.
Next. Thank you. Please drive or take the subway safely home. Thank you for coming.
Great.
That works.
Fred, nice to meet you. Bob Munno, VMI, 81. So I told my wife, it's true that there's only two kinds of boats in the water, right? Submarines and targets.
That's exactly right.
Technically tomorrow, if I could do it,
What's that?
flying him to the Red October and have you stay.
Okay, good.
Tell them what kind of boats are in the water. There's two kinds.
Two kinds, submarines and targets.